By 1932, Germany had become a nation that was in a state of freefall. The level of industrial production had plunged to almost half of what it had been in 1929. It was projected that the real gross national product had decreased by 36%. There were 5.6 million people who were officially considered to be unemployed, and when the underemployed and those who had given up looking for employment were taken into account, the true number was closer to 8 million, out of a total workforce of approximately 25 million. But recession was not the only thing that the Weimar Republic had experienced. The Weimar Republic suffered a series of failures in succession. As a result of the banking crisis that occurred in 1931, when the major commercial banks in Germany went bankrupt, deposits were wiped out, credit was stopped, and the Reichsbank was left with foreign exchange reserves that were, by any reasonable standard, an absolute disaster. During the middle of the 1930s, Germany's reserves were only sufficient to fund 1 week of imports. To put that in context, currently the International Monetary Fund suggests a period of 6 months of buffer regarded as the minimum for basic economic stability. In response to all of this, Chancellor Heinrich Brüning implemented the textbook austerity measures, which included reductions in spending, increases in taxes, and salary reductions. As far as the conventional economics of the day were concerned, the hypothesis was valid. However, the outcomes produced a disastrous outcome. The rate of deflation accelerated, and in addition to an increase in unemployment, there was a rise in the number of political radicalisms of every kind. And then on January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed to the position of Chancellor. If you ask different people, the events that transpired in the economy over the subsequent 6 years can be categorized as either the most daring macroeconomic intervention in the history of modern times, or the most serious financial scam that has ever been committed against a major industrialized state. It was, in fact, both. The man at the center of this story is Hjalmar Schacht. Schacht was a technocrat of exceptional intelligence. He had previously served as the president of the Reichsbank. In 1923, he was the sole individual responsible for stabilizing the Rentenmark, a temporary currency that was issued in Weimar Germany on November 15, 1923, to replace the worthless Papiermark. This event brought an end to Germany's unprecedented hyperinflation. He had connections around the world, the Bank of England respected him, and German businesses trusted him. In particular, Hitler required him due to the fact that he was not a fanatic. Indeed, he was a problem solver, and by 1933, the crisis that Germany was facing was, at least by the standards of the time, insurmountable. The first limitation that Schacht had to deal with was that Germany was unable to borrow money from other countries. The nation's default on the loans under the Dawes and Young Plan resulted in no influx of foreign capital. The Reich was blacklisted by Wall Street and the City of London due to the fact that Germany openly refused to uphold its existing international obligations. Second, Germany was unable to depreciate the Reichsmark because Hitler was ideologically opposed. The ideological opposition of Hitler was based on the fact that devaluation carried with it an excessively powerful memory of the fall of the Weimar Republic, which meant that the political cost was unbearable. Third, the Reichsbank was subject to legal constraints that prevented it from directly funding the economy through the printing of money, and even if those constraints could have been stretched, an excessive money supply could have led to inflation spiraling out of control and becoming financially and politically disastrous. Lastly, taxation was also not an adequate means of funding in Germany. That was because there was nothing left in the economy to tax on a large scale, as the economy was in the midst of a depression. And yet, on June 8, 1933, the same day that Germany declared a moratorium on its debt, Schacht sat in a room with Hitler, Defense Minister Blomberg, Göring, and officials from the Aviation Ministry, and approved a rearmament program that would cost 35 billion Reichsmarks over the course of 8 years. To put this into perspective, the entire national income of Germany had dropped to around 43 billion Reichsmarks by the year 1933. For a nation that was in the midst of the Great Depression, he was committing to spend between 5 and 10% of the country's gross domestic product on the military annually for almost a decade. Doing this through the usual means was not possible. The fact that Schacht discovered an abnormal way was both his genius and his wickedness. Schacht came up with an idea known as the Mefo bill. The name was derived from the Metallurgical Research Corporation, whose full name was Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft. Mefo was a shell company. Krupp, Siemens, Vereinigte Stahlwerke, Deutsche Industriewerke, and Gute Hoffnungsschule were the 5 major German industrial companies that contributed to the incorporation of a ghost enterprise with a capital of only 1 million Reichsmarks. Both the fact that these businesses would be able to profit from the rearmament orders and the fact that their high credit ratings provided the bills with financial legitimacy were factors that led to their inclusion. The Mefo itself did not produce anything. No meaningful assets were owned, and it employed no real workforce. Here is how the system worked. One of the weapons contractors, for example, an aircraft manufacturer, fulfills an order for the new Luftwaffe military aircraft. Instead of receiving payment in Reichsmarks from the government budget, the contractor is given a bill by Mefo, a promissory note with a term of 6 months and an interest rate of 4%. This note was issued in the name of this fictitious organization. The contractor then takes this bill to his bank. His financial institution is willing to take it because the Reichsbank has made a commitment to discount all Mefo bills at face value without any conditions. There are no restrictions on the quantity, and there are no time constraints. However, as a matter of fact, the majority of the notes were not cashed right away. This was due to the fact that they carried competitive interest and were practically insured by the Reichsbank. Since they earned interest, banks, savings institutions, and industrialists maintained them as short-term investments because they were profitable. But none of this was included in the official government budget, and this is perhaps the most important aspect. The majority of ordinary Germans, as well as international creditors and foreign observers, did not see an exploding deficit. They witnessed a government that gave the impression of being fiscally responsible, despite the fact that it was covertly investing billions of dollars in military vehicles, aircraft, and warships. A total of 12 billion Reichsmarks worth of Mefo banknotes were issued between the years 1934 and 1938. By the year 1938, that number was outstanding across the entirety of the German financial system, which represented a liability that was almost equivalent to the entire yearly budget of Germany. It was astounding what Schacht had accomplished in terms of macroeconomics. In order to put together a shadow money plan that was off-balance sheet, off-budget, legally unclear, and operationally smart, he had utilized commercial bill mechanics, which is the most orthodox and dry instrument that a central banker may have in their toolkit. Because they were circulated as productive credit, the bills did not immediately cause inflation. This was because they supported real output in an economy that was severely underemployed, and Schacht was boosting demand in an economy that was operating at a capacity that was quite low. As a result, the unemployment rate, which had been higher than 30% in the year 1932, came down to virtually zero by the year 1938. Gains in real earnings were made, and industrial production reached new heights. The shift that Germany underwent was nothing short of miraculous. The bills, however, were now about to be due. In reality, the Mefo bills were only a portion of the problem. It was also necessary for Schacht to provide funding for the initiative through the domestic capital market. In order to accomplish these goals, he had to acquire the savings of regular Germans. Contemporary accounts written by German businessmen in exile describe this process with cold precision. The state had made the decision to take advantage of the short-term money market on a massive scale. Specifically, this is what that meant in the real world. The Nazi regime completely shut down the capital market, making it inaccessible to any private borrowers. It was impossible for businesses to issue new bonds or shares without first receiving clearance from the government. The Reich itself was the only borrower in Germany at scale. A decree was issued that required financial institutions such as banks, savings institutions, and insurance companies to hold government bonds and treasury bills. These institutions had amassed huge pools of depositor money. As a result, the assets that were supposed to be diversified and liquid on their balance sheets became frozen. In the beginning of 1935, the government issued a decree that reduced bond coupon rates across the board, bringing them down from a rate of 6% until they reached 4%. This affected around 10 billion marks of debt that was still due. This was not a conversion that was done voluntarily. Creditors, who were German citizens and held these bonds, had at least 1/4 of their interest income taken away from them. And by the year 1936, it was estimated that the state alone was responsible for absorbing between 80 and 90% of all new capital formation in Germany. The average German saver had, without even realizing it, become the unaware funder of the rearmament undertaken by the Third Reich. Nevertheless, the fundamental structure consisted of a claim on the future that could only be paid out if Germany was victorious or if it stole. The recovery that Schacht had created was on the verge of choking itself by the time the summer of 1934 rolled around. Iron ore, copper, rubber, cotton, and oil were some of the raw materials that were required for Germany's rearmament campaign. The majority of these materials had to be imported, but Germany had a very limited amount of foreign currency available to pay for them, and only 1 week's worth of imports could be covered by the reserves held by the Reichsmark. The fix that Schacht came up with was the new plan of 1934, which was a system that imposed complete bureaucratic control over Germany's international trade. Each and every import application would be reviewed by 25 supervision agencies, one for each major commodity class. Additionally, scarce foreign exchange would be distributed according to national priority. Rearmament suppliers were given priority, followed by exporters in the order of priority. There was a significant amount of pressure placed on consumer items such as textiles, leather, and food. This was a fundamental tension for an administration that was promoting economic recovery and full employment, and it was managed almost completely through propaganda. Schacht was also in charge of the development of bilateral clearance agreements, which involved the trading of German industrial goods to southeastern Europe and Latin America in exchange for raw materials. In order to maintain the partners' support, Schacht frequently paid prices that were higher than the market. The system was remarkable in both its level of complexity and its degree of vulnerability. Germany was able to maintain the international trade of one of the largest economies in the world, with reserves that would have been critically inadequate for a country that was only 10th the size of Germany. It was successful, but barely. Moreover, this was solely due to the fact that Schacht was willing to take brinkmanship to its maximum limit. But it was not going to last. By 1936, it was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain the economic justification that supported the entire system. The status regarding foreign exchange remained extremely uncertain, and Schacht, the individual who was responsible for constructing all of this, was concerned. In 1936, Göring was given the responsibility of leading the new 4-year plan, which was tasked with the objective of preparing Germany economically for war within a period of 4 years, along with a major push in the direction of autonomy. Schacht was against it. He made the argument, which was true, that the expenses were catastrophic, that Germany could not afford to produce domestically what it could purchase more cheaply overseas, and that the financial condition was already at the point where it was about to break. He was, however, disregarded. By the beginning of 1937, despite the ambitious announcement of the 4-year plan, the procurement of military supplies had practically been halted because there was an insufficient supply of steel. Based on projections, it was anticipated that the Wehrmacht's ammunition inventories would not reach their required levels until the autumn of 1942. The military, which was the most important component of Hitler's war machine, was not prepared for the war that was being planned. In August of 1937, Göring staged a dramatic summons of 300 leaders from the steel sector to the Air Ministry. He threatened them with forced expropriation if they did not develop Germany's low-grade indigenous iron ore. Following this, he established the Reichsmark Hermann Göring, a steel conglomerate that was owned by the state, and he started the process of forcibly purchasing private mineral reserves. Schacht fought against this, and he received support from several of the largest and most prominent industrial companies. According to economics, he was correct, but he was unsuccessful because Göring had wiretaps from the Gestapo on his own ministry, and Hitler had already made up his mind. The dismissal of Schacht from his position as head of the Reichsbank took place on January 19, 1939. On April 1, 1938, the Mefo bill program had already been officially terminated. The thing that took its place was more vulgar and more coercive. The purchase of government bonds was mandated for the banks. The raids on insurance firms and savings accounts were carried out with a greater magnitude. In 1939, when the government was no longer able to pay off its armament expenditures, industrialists were forced to accept partial payment in the form of special bills that could only be redeemed against future taxes. The tax revenues of the future were being mortgaged. This is the part of the story that beyond its financial architecture is truly unsettling, and now we have reached it. These Mefo bills were instruments with a term of 5 years. 1934 to 1938 was the time period covered by the program. By 1939, they were due to arrive. 12 billion Reichsmarks were due. Germany did not have 12 billion Reichsmarks. However, Austria did. According to official records, Austria's gold and foreign exchange reserves were more than 4 times greater than those of the Reichsbank, and its private holdings were estimated at more than double of that. Austria was annexed into Germany in March of 1938. The Reichsbank was the recipient of the gold. All of the foreign currency was transferred to the Reichsbank. The Aryanization policy of the regime resulted in the confiscation of the assets of Jewish Austrians, including assets like businesses, bank accounts, and property. Then Hitler occupied Czechoslovakia. The Czech gold reserves were confiscated, including funds deposited at the Bank of England in London, in a transaction that remains one of the most embarrassing episodes in the Bank of England's history because the British government had already placed a strict freeze on all Czech financial assets in the UK to protect them from Nazi looting. However, the Czech gold in question was technically held in London under the name of the Bank for International Settlements, a legally neutral international banking umbrella based in Switzerland. The transfer was routed through a Bank of International Settlements account, and after the occupation of Prague, the BIS ordered the gold to be moved to a Reichsbank account. The Bank of England carried out the transfer, arguing that it was acting on BIS instructions. It became one of the most controversial episodes in the bank's history. The Czech seizure included food reserves calculated to supply the entire republic for 18 months, the equipment of a well-supplied army, and assets stripped from Jewish-owned businesses. The pattern is easy to see. Each annexation resulted in the seizure of sufficient raw materials and hard currency to buy Germany a few more months of stability and security. The beginning of the conquest of Europe was marked by the invasion of Poland, which took place on September 1, 1939. Countries that were occupied were compelled to pay exorbitant occupation fees, which were daily financial tributes that ran into the billions of Reichsmarks for each country. Gold was taken from the central banks of France, the Netherlands, and Belgium. The machinery used in industry was disassembled and transported to the east. Throughout the occupied territories of Europe, millions of workers were coerced into working for the German war economy in order to maintain production. In an economy that functions normally, the market will eventually discover that a government is operating a secret deficit of 5 billion marks. Because the bond yields will begin to rise, instances of currency runs occur, the capital runs away and the game's over. But not a single one of those mechanisms worked in Nazi Germany. This was due to the fact that capital controls were absolute. It was forbidden for citizens to transfer money outside of the country. The refusal of banks to hold state paper was not an option. All private issuers were not permitted to participate in the stock market. The Reichsbank could be ordered to absorb any quantity of bills. Those journalists who reported on the actual state of the economy were put behind bars. By 1938, the total amount of the floating debt load, which included work creation bills and Mefo bills, were estimated to be roughly 16 billion marks. If the economy had been functioning normally, that would have resulted in an immediate inflationary pressure. During the time of Nazi Germany, the state simply refused to allow that to take place. It could prohibit rediscounting. By decree, it had the potential to transform the bills into perpetual loans, and it could seize the private assets that were still available. There was no stable equilibrium in this situation. It turned out to be a pressure cooker. It was only via continued expansion that the pressure could be brought under control. In the event that expansion were to cease, the internal pressure would continue to increase until something finally gave way. It was only possible to move forward, which meant more production, more conquering, and more seizure. Hitler had fired Schacht after he cautioned that the current financial situation called for significant reductions in spending, and as soon as the bills were due, Hitler launched an invasion. The war was not merely an ideological project or a territorial ambition. In addition, it served as a means for collecting debts. Until it couldn't, the system maintained its hold on power by the use of force and conquest. Following the events of D-Day, the seizure pipeline started to break down. In addition to the destruction of rail links and fuel supplies caused by Allied bombing, the Reichsmark began to lose value on the black market as the war economy began to fall apart. By 1945, Germany's financial system had collapsed under its own weight. Despite the fact that they had been included on the balance sheet of the Reichsbank, the Mefo banknotes were kept alive until the collapse of the state in May of 1945. At which point they became worthless. At the Nuremberg trial, Schacht was found not guilty of the conspiracy accusations that were connected to aggressive war, despite the fact that he had contributed to the construction of the system itself. The losses were absorbed by the financial institutions, insurers, and savers who owned the paper. Despite the fact that the recovery had been genuine, the framework that was there was not. It was a military machine that was established on borrowed time, and it was maintained via the use of secrecy, coercion, and conquest. The economics of the Nazi regime was not a miracle. It was an explosive bomb.